undeniably true that in the last decades the empirical sciences they discovered a lot of new findings about how the brain works, how the different areas within the brain, how they interact. However, it would be false conclusion to assume that from this empirical research about the brain that one can also deduce or can make the inference that we are just a bunch of neurons, as you were just saying. I would say we have to distinguish between two levels. On the one hand, we have empirical research about the brain functions, and of course this research is very interesting, it's very fascinating because it tells us what has to be true, what has to be the case, what systems of the brain have to work properly so that we are able to perceive, to cognize, to rationalize, to act. From this view, like how the brain works, however, it's still a far way to claim that we are identical with the brain. So it's one thing to say the brain is necessary, it's a necessary material precondition for our proper functioning as a human person, but it's still another claim, and it's a much stronger claim to say that we are identical with our brain. In order to establish this brain, you would have to show that, well, all what the human person is about is at the end just reducible to certain brain functions, and that's a very, very strong metaphysical claim. It's for certain true that the brain is a very complex system. It's very fascinating to know how the brain works. However, one should not forget that the brain is just one organ of the human being, and there are many other organs, there are many other bodily functions which are also very interesting. And so if someone knows how the brain works, then of course, or it's probably too much to know that one person knows everything about the brain, but just if someone knows how certain parts of the brain, certain functions of the brain works, then of course such a person knows a lot. But one should also remember that research in the last decades has shown that an isolated view on the brain might not be sufficient, might not be appropriate for properly understanding even how brain functions work. So for a long time, the view was that everything that has to do with cognition, with perception, it's basically related just to the brain. So if you take perception, for instance, then of course you need a visual apparatus, you need the eyes, but these are more like the lenses that let the information in, but then the brain has to do all the work. And recent research has shown that the brain together with the body, only if you look at the brain together with the body, then you understand in a proper and adequate way how the brain itself works. So it seems that in order to understand only how the brain works, you have to focus also on other bodily systems and how the brain is embedded within the entire human organism. So there's, for instance, a recent movement called embodied cognition, and proponents of this movement, they would say, well, in order to understand how we perceive, how we cognize, we have to take into consideration not just brain functions, but also how the brain is embedded within the organism, plus the environment in which the organism finds itself. So this would be like one answer, that if someone knows the brain, then this person knows a lot, but still there's much more to be known, and even for knowing the brain, more has to be known than just things about the brain. And there's a second important aspect, I think, which should also be underlined. The human being is not just an organism. It's a social being, it's a political being, it's an ethical being. So these are other very important dimensions of the human person, of our existence. And these are dimensions that cannot be explicated in terms of brain functions. If I'm asking myself about some ethical issues, if I'm trying to solve an ethical problem, then it doesn't help if someone tells me what's going on in the brain, which brain areas are working right now when I'm making this ethical decision making. So that's like a second point which has to be mentioned. We are not just organisms, and therefore a purely organistic or a purely perspective of the human person from the point of view of biology or the brain sciences or other natural sciences would not be enough for really understanding the overall like multi-dimensionality of the human existence. Someone might have the impression that the brain is, if the brain is the most complex system in the universe, then the brain must be somehow different from other material complex systems. However, I think that in this case there's no difference in principle, it's just a matter of degree. You have different material systems with a different degree of complexity, and maybe the brain is on the top, so you might have like less complex material systems, and then you climb up the ladder, and on the top there is the brain as the most complex system. But the main reason why I think that it's just a matter of degree and not there's no qualitative jump, so to say, is that you can investigate material systems from a purely impersonal point of view. So I think you don't have to change the perspective in order to understand how the brain as brain works. Some people might have the idea that there's a difference because the brain activity subserves our cognitive capacities. So some people might have the idea, well, if the brain is maybe the most important organ for us as a human person, because without the brain we cannot think, we cannot perceive, we cannot reflect, and therefore the brain must be somehow different from other organs. However, I think that's a mistake, because just looking at the brain as brain, everything you can know about the brain, it can be known from a third person impersonal point of view, so you don't have to change any perspective. Once you want to know why a person is doing something, let's say for instance why my arm goes up, so I have two ways of describing this movement. I can say, well, that's just an inner reflex of some neurophysiological processes going on within inside me, and then all I need to explain this movement of my arm going up is an impersonal point of view, right? I need just to know what's going on inside me in order to see that the effect of this processes is my arm going up. On the other hand, if my arm goes up for a certain purpose, because I want to give you a sign, for instance, then I'm performing an action. And performing this action cannot be described anymore from a purely impersonal point of view. So this means that then you have to change the perspective. Then you're looking at this action of the arm going up from a first personal point of view, or from the point of view of the agent. The agent wants to achieve a certain goal. He wants to tell you something. He wants to give you a sign. And these are like this whole normative context within the action, like the aim or the plan to give you a sign, the plan to communicate with you in some form. These normative dimensions, they cannot be explained anymore by looking at the brain. So even though the brain might be extremely complex, even though the brain might be necessary for performing my action of raising my arm, just looking at the brain does not help me to understand why I was raising my arm. For understanding why I was doing this, you have to change the perspective. You have to change from an impersonal to a personal perspective. You have to reason, or you have to take into account my reasons. You have to take into account a certain normative context, and these are all features of the human person that cannot be seen, that cannot be studied anymore from the like impersonal point of view. So even though knowing everything about the brain's complexity would not really help you to understand these very important and basic features of our human existence, and therefore I think that even if the brain is far more complex than any other material system, it's still a matter of degree, and you don't need any additional or completely different epistemic access for understanding what the brain is doing when the brain is performing certain activities. As I was indicating in one of my previous answers, I think that there are at least two basic fundamental perspectives we can assume when it comes to reality. On the one hand, we can assume a third personal or impersonal point of view, and on the other hand, a personal or first personal point of view. And I think when it comes to engage with other persons, then a personal point of view is necessary. In order to see someone else as a person, I have to take a first personal perspective. I cannot, from a third personal perspective, I won't see the other entity, so to speak, as a person. So this seems to, at least this seems to indicate that naturalism or the natural sciences in general, that they don't tell us everything about what there is to know when it comes to reality. So the natural sciences, they tell us a whole lot. They tell us a lot about the material constitution of reality, but once it comes to the human person, once it comes to the personal level, once it comes to phenomena concerning our subjectivity, the first personal perspective, then these are all phenomena which seem to eschew the grasp of the natural sciences. One might have the impression that since the natural sciences were so extremely successful in explaining how the material world is constituted, how the different parts of the material world are interacting, what causal features they have. So one might have the impression that natural science at the very end will tell us or can give us a comprehensive and a definite answer for everything that there is in the world. However, I think that's a misunderstanding, that's a overgeneralization. The natural sciences might maybe at some point in the future be able to tell us everything what there is to know about the material aspects of reality. But there are very good arguments to assume that there are also other non-material aspects of reality, and for these aspects, other disciplines like philosophy, maybe also psychology, theology, are more adequate for studying these phenomena. I think it's true to claim that at least at a certain time in Western history, many philosophers and scientists were very optimistic that at one future point they will solve everything there is to know about reality thanks to scientific progress. Even if you read people at the beginning of modernity like Descartes or Gassendi or Boyle, so Newton, these were all people, they were very much, just because of the enormous progress science was doing at these times, so they were really enthusiastic, they were really optimistic that at one future point science will just solve all empirical problems. I think nowadays most scientists and philosophers of science, they have realized that the material world might be far more complex as it was assumed in previous times. Just think about the change from the Newtonian to quantum mechanics, quantum mechanics physics. So it seems that the world is far more complex, that at the very bottom of physical reality, that there are things going on that we have, at least from our common sense view, it's very hard for us to grasp these phenomena. We might, like thanks to mathematics, we might describe them, we can establish the functions describing these phenomena, but like from a common sense point, it's very hard to grasp what is really going on the quantum level, for instance. So I think this is one reason why people have become more cautious about claiming that at one point science will solve all the problems. On the other hand, I think many scientists, they make certain claims that science might at some point explain everything about the material world. But what these scientists, according to my opinion, what most of the time they really want to say is that for doing research, we have to assume only that the world is material. We don't have to assume any extra non-material entities which somehow help us to explain what is going on in the material world. So it seems to me that very often people are making, even though they talk as if the idea would be that science will explain everything there is, what they really want to say is just that science might in principle be able to explain everything there is in the material world, and for explaining the material world we don't have to assume any other non-material entities. But that's a far more modest claim. That would just be the claim that in principle this might be a possibility, but it's not the claim that we are very close to at this point, and it's also not the claim that everything there is just material. This would be an altogether different claim. It's one thing to say there's a material world and I have a certain methodology for explaining this material aspect of reality. But it's an altogether different and much more stronger claim to say that all of reality is just material, and therefore science is also able to explain all of reality. So as I was saying before, there are many features of our existence, for instance, the dimension of ethics, the dimension of our social interactions, the interpersonal dimension. These are all dimensions that require also other epistemic access, and only a purely scientific access and access from the natural sciences alone would not help us to properly grasp and understand the importance of these dimensions for our existence. It's very hard to define what naturalism is. I guess there's not one specific naturalism, but there are many different naturalisms. Just to give you an example, one might be a methodological naturalist. That means one might say, when it comes to science, when it comes to how I'm investigating reality, then in terms of my methodology, I'm a naturalist. I'm assuming that all what I need for doing a proper investigation about reality is the assumption that there exist natural, or let's call it a more precise manner, physical entities. So one might say I'm assuming that all I need for understanding what is going on in the material world, all what I need is at the end the assumption that there exist physical entities. These entities have physical properties, and the relations, the causal relations between these entities are also explicable in physical terms. So this means this person is making just a methodological claim, because he or she says this methodology is enough for explaining a certain realm of reality. It might be that there are other entities. It might be that there are immaterial souls. It might be that there are gods. It might be that there are spirits, entities that are not accessible from a physical point of view. They might exist, but they are just not part of my research program. So the claim of the methodological naturalist can be seen as rather modest. It's just saying, I'm using this methodology and I'm assuming within this methodological grasp of reality that all what there is are some physical entities. But it might still be that some other entities of another kind exist, but they just fall outside the scope of my research. So this would be methodological naturalism. Then one might be an ontological naturalist. That's a much stronger claim. The ontological naturalist would say all what there is, all what there exists is just some physical reality. So the ontological naturalist is explicitly denying that there can be any immaterial souls, spirits, minds, gods, or any other entities that are not at the end reducible to some physical entities. So I guess you see that the ontological naturalist makes a much more stronger claim because it's a strong ontological claim, whereas the methodological naturalist is just making a claim about a certain methodology. You might just say that's the best methodology we have for explaining a certain part of reality. So that would be one, like the first part of my answer. There's not one naturalism, but there are many naturalisms. When it comes to the question which form of naturalism might be the more interesting one, then I would say, well, that's ontological naturalism. That's just very makes a strong claim. At the end, ontological naturalism goes hand in hand with a reductionist program, at least in the sense that our complex world, how we perceive it, at the end has to be reduced to some fundamental physical entities interacting with each other. That's it's not just a strong claim, it's also a fascinating program. Like if someone would really be able to achieve this reduction, so that would be a very interesting result about our reality, because then it could be shown that indeed all what there is in reality is just physical. It's another question whether this really can be achieved, but I'm just saying, I guess the more interesting, the philosophical interesting position would be ontological naturalism. Now, naturalism should not be confused with natural science. Naturalism is a philosophical claim. If I'm saying all what there is in reality is physical or some physical entities, so this is a philosophical claim. It's not a claim that can directly derive from natural sciences, let's say physics. Of course, physics is assuming a methodological naturalism. Physics says all what I can explain as a physicist, I have to explain it in terms of physics. So my methodological access to the world is a physical one. But there still might be some other entities, but they just fall outside the scope of my expertise, the scope of my research, my field of research. So I think that the natural sciences, they can perfectly live well without naturalism. They can say, well, we try to investigate these features of reality that are accessible to our methodology, and these features of reality they have to be somehow materially constituted. There can be other features of reality, but they just fall outside the scope of science. Let's assume God exists, then of course this would be an additional entity which would show that ontological naturalism would be wrong, but this would leave natural science, the whole process of natural investigation, untouched, because as a natural scientist, I could still continue my research. I could still try to find out many things about the physical world, even if there exists an immaterial God. So it would just naturalism, ontological naturalism, would be disproved by the existence of God, but the whole scientific process, also scientific progress, would not be somehow undermined or would not be somehow blocked by this discovery that there exists an immaterial God. Naturalism is surely a kind of faith if it's taken in its radical form, like I was saying in my previous answer. If one is an ontological naturalist, then of course one believes, one has a certain form of faith that all what there is to reality is material. So there's just a material reality. This might put the naturalist insofar in a certain problematic position, because on the other hand, the naturalist is not just saying that all what there is material, but the naturalist has also to say, well, I'm following science wherever science leads us. So, and it seems that the more basic fundaments of reality, they become less and less material, in the sense that the deeper to go, the less materialized, at least in the traditional sense, the ultimate entity of reality seem to be. So once you reach the quantum level, it's not that we are still confronted with material entities as we understand them from our common sense perspective, but it seems that we lose sight of the materiality of these ultimate phenomena. So it might seem, or one might have the impression that at the end naturalism is really a kind of faith, in the sense that science is not backing up these naturalistic claims anymore, or at least the whole endeavor for formulating such a naturalistic claim becomes more and more difficult in the light of new physical discoveries in this sense. One might also say that even if it, at a higher level, if it comes to biology, for instance, there are now many people claiming that in order to understand certain biological phenomena, you have to think in a holistic way. So you cannot break down complex biological phenomena to simpler biological subsystems, but you have to take a view on the whole complex feature or phenomenon that you want to investigate. So this might be another, at least, frontier, barrier, where it gets harder and harder for really hardcore naturalists to put their program, which at the end is a reductionist program, into practice. So I think that science itself, also the term science, maybe I might add also this thought, there is not one science, but there are many different sciences, and there is also not one scientific methodology, but many different scientific methodologies. So it seems that naturalists are very often assuming a kind of harmony, a kind of unity within the sciences, but once you look at the sciences themselves, then you don't find this harmony, you don't find this unity anymore, but you find just many different approaches to reality, many different methodologies, many different research programs, and they don't seem to have like one or a few core features which they all share. So it seems that the scientific progress, scientific process as such is more disordered and less organized as it is sometimes assumed from the side of naturalistic minded philosophers. One might also say that naturalism is a certain form of faith, in this sense that the optimism certain naturalists have in the progress of science, that this optimism comes from the past. It comes from, like, they seem to be inclined to think that since science was so successful in the past, this progress, this succession of success will also continue in the future, and at some point in the future, so to say, the scientific success will encompass all of reality. So what they seem to assume is that we can make the inference that a glorious past, so to say, legitimates us to assume that also the future will be glorious and that at the end natural science will explain everything there is to be explained. However, one might say that on the one hand you cannot make this inference from the past towards the future. We just don't know what the future brings. It might also be that the scientific progress, however, or no matter how successful it was in the past, that it comes to a certain end, that there are just certain limits of what can be known. I mean, you were mentioning ethical issues, so one might say that ethics is very important to, at least when it comes to the human existence. We are all the time confronted with ethical issues, but they don't seem to be part of science in the sense that science can solve ethical issues, but you need arguments, you have to reason about ethical issues. So this seems to be just one important feature of our human existence, of our human perception of reality also, which is not covered by science anymore. And it seems that this is not just a matter of complexity. It's not just that you can say, well, we don't know now, but we don't know yet, but we will know it in the far future. But it seems to be an in principle, just one in principle barrier which science is not able to surpass. I think interdisciplinary exchange is very important. It is to a certain extent just the insight that reality is so complex that a single individual cannot have a complete overview, can have a very deep grasp of all these different aspects of reality. So I think the more, with the progress of modern science, it becomes more and more, or it has become more and more clear that we know more and more of less and less. So we are focusing on more and more specific small parts of reality, and we know a whole lot about these small parts of reality. But of course this means also that if someone becomes an expert in a certain discipline, then this whole specialization process begins earlier and earlier, because there's so much to know just about one field of research. So it's even within one discipline, people are saying that they don't know everything about one field of discipline anymore, because there's so much new knowledge that has been acquired in the course of the last centuries. So this makes interdisciplinary exchange even more timely now than in earlier times, because in earlier times one might have said that the overall body of knowledge is still limited, so some person might still have had a very good overview about the overall body of knowledge, but this is not possible anymore. So on the one hand, interdisciplinary exchange is just very important in order to just to get an idea of how complex reality is, of how many different bodies of knowledge, so to say, there are. And on the other hand, I think what is also extremely fruitful and important when it comes to interdisciplinary exchange, that it makes us very humble. Talking to people from another discipline, talking to scholars which are working in a completely different field, makes us very often aware that other people are concerned with questions, that other people get very enthusiastic about questions that we so far never thought of. So these questions even didn't come to our mind so far, and then all of a sudden we realize, well, there are people working for decades just on a question which so far did not even come to my mind. So it seems it makes us also humble. It shows us also how flexible the human mind is. Like Aristotle is saying at the beginning of the Metaphysics, that we have this deep desire to know. We want to know how reality is structured. And so interdisciplinary research makes us aware about this deep desire inside the human person, this desire to know more and more about reality. So I think interdisciplinary research tells us something important about just the whole complexity of reality. It tells us also something about the own limits of the research we are doing. It makes us humble. It makes us also aware that our field of research is just one among many others, that maybe we should also not take us so seriously all the time, or take the questions we are concerned with not as so serious, because there are other people being concerned with completely different questions in completely different fields of expertise, fields of research. And the how of interdisciplinary exchange, well, that's a very good question. It seems to me that one has to listen a lot. Like, it's a how can the best interdisciplinary exchange being done? Well, I think you have to listen a lot. You have to be willing to invest also a lot of time just to understand, sometimes just understand, well, why this is even a problem at all for the other person. Sometimes that might take a long process, because if you're not acquainted with this field of research, so sometimes you might not even understand why is this other person so concerned with this question. So I think it takes also a lot of time just to get or to acquire a bit of the mindset of another scholar coming from a different field of research. And then I think it's just important to listen a lot, to talk a lot, maybe also to have this attitude that at the end I might not know what I get from this whole discussion. It's not that I don't think that one should enter an interdisciplinary discourse with this expectation that now I get out more for my own research. Maybe at the end I might have learned a lot, I might have gained many insights, but maybe these insights are not directly connectable to the stuff I'm doing, I'm concerned with. So it helps, it's nourishment for the mind. It opens up our mind, it nourishes our mind, and it helps us to learn more about what other people are concerned with. And I think these are the most important aspects, and also the most profitable aspects when it comes to interdisciplinary discourse. I don't think that we are lost at all. What the discussion of the last, 40, 50 years about personal identity has shown is rather that the whole, it's a complex issue, but at the end you could also say, you have these 4 or 5 different approaches, and it gives you kind of like the discussion. Once you have an overlook about the discussion, it gives you a kind of mind map. So what the discussion shows, I think, is that the complexity lies in this specific nature of the human person. On the one hand, we are biological beings. On the other hand, we are also psychological beings. On the other hand, we are social beings. And so the different accounts, they focus always on one feature of this, of our existence, and make the claim that this feature is the most important one, or is the decisive one when it comes to identity through time. So, for instance, you might say the so-called biological account claims that all what we are at the very end we are a biological organism, and so what keeps us in time is just an organic process. It's just a certain process of life, and as long as your life continues to exist, you as a biological organism continue to exist as well. So the idea is basically that you are the same organism as a fetus, as an adult person, and let's assume you will at one future point end up in an irreversible vegetative state, then you still continue to have the same life, and this makes you still the same entity, even though all your rational capacities, all your capacities to think and to interact as a person have begun, but still the same organism is there, so it's still you continuing to exist. So this might be the claim, or this is the claim that a proponent of this view might make. Then you might have other people claiming that what you are in an ontological sense is you're a psychological entity, and what makes you the same over time is a certain continuity of your psychological states. So if you lose all your psychological states because of an accident, so to say, if you end up in an irreversible vegetative state, then the proponents of this view would say, well, now you as a psychological entity, you are gone. Maybe the organism is still there, but you are not the organism. So that's just a conclusion proponents of this view are drawing, because their focus is on your psychological life and not on your biological life. There might be like a third account, it's generally called the narrative account. Proponents of this account, they will say it's the capacity to tell a story, so the capacity to narrate your own story, what makes you a person. And you might extend this view and you might say, well, sometimes it's not you narrating a person, but there are other people narrating a person on behalf of you or narrating a story about you, and this is already enough for making you a person or for keeping you into existence. So as long as there is someone telling a story about you, as long as this story has certain features in terms of coherence, in terms of a red line going through this story, as long you continue to exist. So I think what this discussion, although it's very complex, and of course if you go into the details it becomes very intricate and complicated, but what this overall discussion has shown is just that it's hard to say at the end what constitutes our identity, just because it seems that our nature, so to speak, is very complex. We are not just organisms, but we are an organism endowed with certain cognitive capacities. We are in an intrinsic way related to others, so we are also social beings, and depending on which feature one takes to be the most important one might come up with a different theory about personal identity. Maybe at the end you need to mix them all in a certain sense, or you might have to interconnect them all for really finding out what identity through time consists in. But I think what the discussion nicely shows is that you have different options, and it shows you also what is the strength of an option, what is the advantage of an option, what is the limit of an option, and what price you have to pay if you choose a certain option. And I think that's just generally a feature of philosophical problems. At the end you might not, or philosophers might not agree, this is the only right theory, all the other theories are wrong. Rather they might just say, well, you have a whole set of possible options, and all what philosophy can do is present this set of options, and then it's up to you to decide at the end which option, at least from your personal point of view, looks as the most suitable one, looks as the most coherent one, looks as the most convincing one, and of course then you have always to pay a certain price when adopting this option and not another one. Personal identity in the afterlife, that's a tricky issue. I think philosophy can say a couple of things. Of course, philosophy, we do not know anything for sure about the afterlife. But I think what philosophical theories about personal identity in general, they can just help us to show like which conditions have to be met if we want to, or which conditions have to be met so that we successfully continue to exist in the afterlife, so to say. So on the one hand, you might just think about the different theories about personal identity, about our identity through time. All of these theories, they spell out like what are the main features they are focusing on, what are the costs associated with these theories. And so one might say, well, depending on, like, take the biological view, if you assume that we are just human organisms, that's just our metaphysical nature, so to say, is just to be a biological entity, then this would of course imply that if we want to continue to exist after biological death, then we have to continue in some biological form, right? Otherwise our metaphysical nature, so to say, would change. We would not just, maybe we might get some additional features in the afterlife, but if our metaphysical nature changes, then at least there is a strong intuition that then our existence come to an end and a new existence, the existence of another individual, begins. So it seems that our metaphysical nature has to be preserved through biological death if it is us and not someone else that shows up in the afterlife. Or you might think, if you're psychological, if what really makes you you is your psychological life, then you might say that, well, if it's really me landing in the afterlife, if it's really me that God resurrects, then I must have some psychological connections between this life and the life to come. So I think philosophy helps us, or the different models of personal identity, they help us just to show like what must be true, what must be the case, so that we can enter the next life and that we continue to exist also in the afterlife. And of course, each theory of personal identity has a different emphasis, and depending on what emphasis you choose, depending on what theory you choose, this affects also your theory about personal identity in the afterlife. The concept of the soul is a very complex issue because it has a long tradition in philosophy, it has a long tradition in theology, and you have not just one like unified concept of the soul, but you have a whole bunch of different concepts which to my view are, if at all, only minimally connected. So let me explain shortly. Like I guess the most popular view nowadays is if people hear about the soul, then they think about the soul in Cartesian terms. They think, well, there's an immaterial soul and there's a material body, and somehow this immaterial soul is controlling the material body. I guess that's just a very popular belief. So the concept of soul is most of the time spelled out in some form of some dualistic notion. However, if one looks at the history of the church, then the more prominent or the original concept of the soul was not in this Cartesian dualistic terms, but the concept of soul derived from ancient philosophy, in particular from the philosophy of Aristotle. That was the most prominent tradition where people used to talk about the soul. And the traditional notion, also in scholastic philosophy of the soul, was that the soul is the form of the body. So what does form of the body mean? The idea was that if you look not just at the human body or at the human individual, but at any living being, then you discover that each being has certain features. It's made up in a very characteristic way. And so the idea was that cannot just be a bunch of matter that is somehow connected. It cannot just be that there are many material particles that are somehow causally connected, and that's all what we can say about the human individual or also other animals. But it seems that they have a very complex constitution, that they display also a very high form of unity. And so the idea was that matter, the material parts, they are connected in this very specific way. They are united in this very specific way because the soul informs all these material parts in a very specific way. So the basic idea was the soul is not something like outside the body that just comes in order to control the body, but the basic idea was that a living organism is always organized in a certain way, and this organization is explained in terms of the form of the body or the soul. So this was basically Aristotle's insights, the insight of Aristotle. Like he was saying, if we want to study a living being, then we have to look at, we have to study the living being from two perspectives. On the one hand, from the perspective of structure, organization, and on the other hand, from the material aspect. The material aspect, that would just be what modern chemistry or physics tells us. But on the other hand, you have also to take into consideration the entire structure of the organism, and therefore this concept of the soul was used in order to explain these highly complex structural features of a living being. So the original concept of the soul was not dualistic, but it was rather monistic. The idea was you have a living being, and since this living being has a certain form, has a certain structure, it has also the capacities which we generally study. So if you look at the dog, you might say, well, the dog has very specific capacities, it has very specific functions, and it has these functions in virtue of the specific soul which dogs have. And if you look at a human being, then a human being has certain vegetative functions, it has sensitive functions, it has rational functions, and all these functions, they are grounded in the human being because the human being is formed in a specific way by the human soul. So the concept of soul was used to explain the unity of the human person. It was also used to explain why all these different capacities which we observe, bodily functions, sensitive perceptual functions, cognitive functions, why all these different functions ground in one and the same individual and are not different separated parts of this one individual. So it was only later on when it came to this dualistic concept of the soul that with Descartes, for instance, then Descartes would say, well, the cognitive functions, they are something completely different from other bodily functions. All the bodily functions, they belong to the body. They can be studied perfectly well by the natural sciences, but once it comes to cognitive functions, then we have to take altogether different account. And then this dualism comes in, and the problem of Descartes was exactly how to bring these different functions together again. From the more traditional concept of the soul, instead, one would say, well, it's exactly the soul that is unifying all these different functions, because the soul is the ultimate ground for all these different functions cooperating, working together, and being structured in the way as we observe that they are. So it seems that the original concept of the soul was not anti-scientific. On the contrary, it helped even. It was, by Aristotle, it was introduced as a kind of scientific notion, as a kind of heuristic notion for understanding the complexity of a human or of other organisms. As I said in my previous answers, natural science is very fascinating. Natural science has provided us with a huge body of knowledge. However, it's just a body of knowledge concerning a certain feature of reality, that is the material feature of reality. There's a whole realm which is not accessible by science as such. Some people talk about the realm of reasons, the space of reasons. So just think about all the ethical issues concerning the meaning of life, various existential questions, questions concerning justice. These are all questions that fall in the proper domain of philosophy. So you might say that in a certain sense, every person is confronted in his or her life with these questions at a certain point, right? Every one of us will ask him or herself, should I now go rather for option A? Should I go for option B? Is it just to do this? Is my life meaningful? I am justified to believe this. Like if you tell me something, so I might also start to think about, well, I'm really justified to believe you. You are telling me something which sounds rather strange. So should I assume that this is still justified in taking you seriously, or maybe I should not think that what you are telling me now, that it's still a good thing to believe. So these would be questions of epistemology. So we are engaging with philosophical issues in some way or the other all the time. So one might say, on the one hand, science is not explaining us, cannot explain everything. There are other parts of reality which philosophy tends to, or which philosophy has the proper means to explain in a better way. The whole issue of the meaning of life, ethics, and in this sense, every one of us is also, at least in a basic sense, a philosopher. Of course, what distinguishes now someone just asking philosophical questions from a professional philosopher is that the professional philosopher is trained to formulate the questions, is trained also to give answers in a very systematic way. And of course, a trained philosopher also knows a whole lot about history of philosophy. He or she knows what answers have already been provided to this problem, what answers have been given to a certain question, how good these answers might be, what the cost of these answers are. So a professional philosopher is not only dealing with questions that science, because of the methodology of science, cannot deal with, but it's also dealing with these questions in a systematic way. And one might also say that asking these philosophical questions is there's an intrinsic motivation in the human individual to ask such questions. So it's not just that someone at a certain point decides to become a philosopher, or that someone just becomes a philosopher because he or she aims to answer some practical issues, but it seems to be also an intrinsic feature of our nature to ask these questions, to ask questions such as, is it right if I'm assuming these things? Is it right if I do these things? What are good arguments for going into these directions? Are there any good reasons that support this opinion? And once you are engaging with these issues, with these kind of questions, then we are already doing philosophy in a very basic sense. And what a professional philosopher is doing, he or she tries to phrase the questions in a very specific way, and he or she tries to provide also answers, arguments in a corresponding systematic manner. Maybe a last point which is also important to add in this respect is, it seems to me that philosophy has an intrinsic democratic dimension. What I'm observing is that nowadays many governments and policymakers, they focus very much on the technical sciences and the natural sciences. So it seems to be a certain idea that at the end all the problems, or the most urgent problems we have, that they have to be solved in terms of certain techniques, in terms of technical progress, or in terms of like progress in the natural sciences. However, it seems to me that there are many issues in our society that are genuinely philosophical problems. Problems about justice, also problems about what makes us human, how we should treat other humans. These are all questions which are inherently philosophical questions, and the technical sciences and the natural sciences won't help us in answering these questions. And it seems also to me that once a society stops to ask these questions, then we end up in a kind of technocratic system. Then all, like the whole, well, human existence is then only seen from a technocratic point of view. It's just the idea that at the end the human person is just like a complex machine, and if something is broken, then you have to fix it, you have to change it, you have to repair it. But what is not seen from this perspective is that it's an intrinsic feature of the human person to ask these philosophical questions, and it adds in a very important way to the meaning, to the sense of a person's life, to engage with these questions. So it's my impression that very often people have this idea that since philosophers or philosophical questions, since they don't have a definite answer, but you just have, so as I was saying when I was talking about this issue of personal identity, that all what it seems to me what philosophy can do at the very end is just to present a range of options, and then it's up to each individual person to choose which option is the most suitable for him or her. That it's often people think that if an academic enterprise, if an academic kind of research can only present different options but cannot come up with one final definite option, that then there must be a deficit in this methodology of research or just in this field of research in general. So it seems to me that often philosophy is seen as a kind of deficient way of thinking, of doing research, just because philosophers never come up with one final definite answer, because there's not a progress in philosophy as there's progress in other sciences. But the proper progress in philosophy consists exactly in continuing to ask these questions. And I don't think that philosophers just ask these questions because it's fun, or because they don't have anything else to do, or because they just want to be silly. But philosophers ask these questions because they belong to the very nature of our existence. These are just questions that people are interested in. These questions might be practical, they might be ethical, but they might also be purely theoretical. So there are also some people that are just intrinsically interested in some theoretical questions. For instance, a student of mine, she's a doctor in medicine. She's a trained doctor. She works in a hospital, and in her free time, like one day a week, she comes to university for studying philosophy. And for her, that's just a very intrinsic motivation. So she says that gives her, adds to her meaningfulness of life, just to engage with these questions, even if these questions don't have any bearing on her medical expertise, on her how she sees herself as a medical doctor. That's not important for her at all. It's just because she has this theoretical intrinsic interest, and it adds a tremendous meaning to her life. And I think that's very important also, to see this dimension of philosophy. It adds to our meaning, and philosophical questions seem to be intrinsically bound to what we are. As long as we conceive ourselves as also rational beings, philosophical questions will inevitably come up. And once we stop to ask philosophical questions, I think we are not rational beings anymore, but then we will just turn into some robots or some entities being concerned only with some very narrowed down practical problems.